Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 1st of November. Today we have some updates, so let's start. First we're going to discuss and to start with the Kupiansk frontline, Kupiansk Lyman area, from this area. If we're talking about the front line, we can say that this front line is stable. The Ukrainians did the same thing as they did before. They were trying to attack in direction of Volodimirovka, Kotlyarevka, Kislevka, trying to attack Svatovo from the north. And as a result of those attacks, the Ukrainians lost around 150 soldiers and something around 13 armored vehicles. But today the Russians reported and noted one important thing on this front line. And the thing is that if we are talking about the previous weeks, according to the previous counteroffensive operation, we were expected that the Ukrainians will try to continue developing their offensive operation in direction of Svatovo, trying to return control over the north of LPR. And so that's why they were preparing for offensive operation. And today the Russians reported that they noted that Ukrainians started building fortifications. Very powerful fortification on the east side of Kupiansk, in this area between the Russian forces and the Ukrainians. And some experts are saying that the Ukrainians, maybe they calculated everything, maybe now they have totally different plans or totally different understanding of the situation. But anyway, now they're trying to be also on the safe side if the Russians will start counteroffensive operation in direction of Kupiansk. So that's why the Ukrainians started preparation of fortification in this area. Now, very well fortifications, not just something like temporary things, but very long-term fortification which will allow the Ukrainians to stay on the safe side at least during the winter period. So maybe the Ukrainians have changed their plans, or maybe they understand that before winter comes they are no longer able to do any development in this area. If we're talking about Lyman, there are no changes. The Ukrainians are not preparing any fortification in this area, and we can understand, because if the Ukrainians are not able to take control over the road between Kremenna and Svatovo, this one, and to take towns like Chervona Popovka, Golikova or Plashanka, this area, if they are not able to establish some bridgehead in this area, I understand that they will be forced to leave the side of Zhiribets River during the winter period, because I'm not sure, it's highly unlikely that Ukrainians will be able to supply and support this bridgehead. And the thing is that we understand that now they are able to do this because of green leaves on the trees, and now they still can hide their forces. That now they are still able to hide their tanks, artillery, because of like the period of time when there are still a lot of leaves on the trees and something like this. But when the winter comes, we're gonna see just white snow in this area, and of course the Ukrainians' capabilities of being invisible in this area will be reduced very, very much. And the Russians, it won't be a very difficult job for the Russians to spot any type of crossing on this river, and that's why it will be very difficult for the Ukrainians to hold this bridgehead if they're not able to develop this bridgehead during the next weeks. So that's why, and if we're talking about this area, there is no need to prepare any fortification in this area, because Zhiribets River is a very perfect natural barrier between Russians and Ukrainians, because the Russians also won't be able to cross the river before the next spring. And we discussed this many times, that if the Russians want to return control over Lyman, the only one way to do this is to attack from the north. And this is another reason why the Ukrainians decided to build fortification on this side near Kupiansk, because the Ukrainians understand that if the Russians are planning to attack, they will have to attack from the north, moving the same way that the Ukrainians did during the previous offensive operation. So this situation about Lyman, and if we're talking about Lyman, the Ukrainians lost around 30 soldiers and something around 7 armored vehicles. But as you can see, the map still has this configuration, saying that the Ukrainians do have some possibilities to move in this area. The Russians reported that they have the same possibilities. So according to the Russians, this area is in the gray zone. According to the Ukrainians and according to the facts we see, that the Ukrainians almost every single day make another attempt of attack in the direction of Chervonopopovka. I believe that sometimes the Russians reports about destroying this bridgehead is some kind of speculation, because for now we see what we see, and the facts are saying that Ukrainians do have their bridgehead along the towns like Nevskaya, Terny, Yampolovka, Tarskoye, along Zhiribets River, and for now they are still feel themselves very comfortable in this area. It's about the bridgehead. If we're talking about offensive operations, the Russians feel comfortable from their side in the question of stopping any and ruining any Ukrainian attempt. Another active front line, Belohorivka, Zolotarevka, this area became another active front line between the Russians and the Ukrainians. There are very heavy clashes in this area. The Ukrainians returned control in Belohorivka in September, or in the end of August, the beginning of September, or something like this. And now the Russians wants to return control over this town. They made a few attempts in this direction, but the Ukrainians still there. They feel themselves very nice, and the Russians couldn't achieve any success in this area. Now we are moving to Bakhmut. There are very heavy clashes in this area, but as you can see, there are no changes, no progress in this area. The Russians were trying to attack in direction of Yakovlevka. Some maps, like deployment map, shows that the Russians do have positions, at least in these small suburbs in this area. This road split Yakovlevka in two parts. The north and northwest part is under Ukrainian control, and the southeast part is under Russian control, but the only deployment map is the only map that shows this progress. According to the Russian sources, entire Yakovlevka is under Ukrainian control. The Ukrainians are saying the same thing. And during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians made another attempt of counter-offensive operation from Yakovlevka in direction of the Russian position in Vuhledar. I believe that it was some kind of recon combat or pin down operation, because as you can see, the Russians are attacking Bakhmutska and trying to solve this puzzle with Bakhmutska, but for now this town is still under Ukrainian control and there are no progress from the Russian side. If we are talking about Bakhmut, the south area, there are no changes as well. The only thing that the Russians made another attempt of taking control over Mayorsk. By the way, if we're talking about Mayorsk, the Russians reported at least 2 or 3 times in a row in the past that they established control over this town, but that was some kind of speculation, or maybe they were talking about some other area on this front line. But for now, there are no changes. The only update we saw that Ukrainians were trying to move some reinforcement from Kislishivka in direction of Kurdyumovka and so on, and the Ukrainians built some kind of convoy, and the Russians spotted this convoy. They attacked this convoy with the rockets, and the Ukrainians lost some soldiers in this area. At least a few trucks, armored trucks, were destroyed. They didn't provide the numbers in this area, but the front line is stable. Now we are moving to another activated front line. As we discussed in the past, I told you that if the Russians achieve some success in this area, Vodyana, Opytnaya, Pervomayskaya, and we discussed this many times, that they at least enter the south part of Vodyana. They're, according to their sources, they're clearing this area, and the western sources and deployment source map are saying that there are still Ukrainians, and it's not so beautiful as the Russians draw in this area. Anyway, we can say that this town split in 2 parts. I believe that this part that located on the south from this river is under of these lakes is under Russian control. The north one is under Ukrainians. There are still heavy clashes, and the Russians are pushing. But anyway, this area is still under the Ukrainians. And today we got report that this front line has been activated. The Russians made few attempts of attacking in direction of Novobakhmutovka, in direction of Krasnogorovka, in direction of Kamyanka, and in direction of Alexandropol, this one. So they were attacking all along the front line, trying to find weak position from the Ukrainian side. And as we discussed, if we're talking about this year, the main goal, or at least at this stage, the Russians need to take control over entire Novobakhmutovka. This town, we can say, is located on the Russian side of this front line. So if we compare Novobakhmutovka with Kamyanka, Krasnogorovka, and Alexandropol, this town is the easiest for the Russians, and they were trying to storm all this area, but without any progress and without any success. The Russians and the Western sources haven't provided any information about the number of the losses. The only thing that they told that there were few attempts that the Russians made during the previous hours. If we're talking about Pisky, about, let's say, Pisky frontline, Vodyana, Первомайskaya, as I told you, there were no more updates from Oputnaya, Vodyana, Первомайskaya, just the things that the Russians are still storming. There are a lot of questions about Vodyana, because even the Western sources are saying that there is a fog of war above these territories, no updates from this area, and the only updates we got is from the Russians. So I believe, as from our previous experience, if nobody says anything about this area, that means that there are very heavy clashes, and for now nobody can confirm that they controls this territory, that the Russians are not able to confirm, and the Ukrainians as well. So I believe that the break-in period of time hasn't come yet, so that's why there are still clashes, and I believe that that means that Ukrainians do still have possibilities to stop the Russians and to stop their development in this area. But for now, no updates. So that means that everything is not so beautiful as the Russians reported during the previous days. And we can understand why, because if we're talking about the Ukrainians, they do have possibilities to move reserves, and they did this. The question is how much the Ukrainians have, how many reserves the Ukrainians have, and what is their status, and what is the status of the Russian forces. Interesting update came from Pisky front line. The Russians are moving in direction of Nivoyska. They are very close to this town. They managed to take more fortifications, and both sources, Western and the Russians, confirmed about the fact that the Russians got another checkpoint. As we discussed, as you can see, there is like some squares, and there is like grass, forest between squares, and every single forest line in this area is another fortification, another trenches from the Ukrainian side. So that's why the Russians need to take every single 100 meters and to start everything from the beginning. So this is a very long job. This map shows that the Ukrainians have, as you can see, in one fortification, another, and more fortification, more. So believe me, the same thing there in this forest as well. But there is no updates on this map, but it doesn't mean that there are no fortifications. So that's why the Russians, I believe that they got control over this square. And now, if we're talking about Nivoyska, I believe that just one line left before the storming of this town. If we're talking about the direct attack, if the Russians want to attack this Nivoyska, let's say from the flanks, they need to take, I believe, another 3 or 4 fortifications in the south and maybe 2 on the north. So there are still a lot of job to do. But the Russians, they are very experienced in storming. If we're talking about this area, there was a video how the Russians managed to get control over this fortification, and furthermore, they managed to capture around 5 or 6 Ukrainians who were there, who stuck in those trenches and who couldn't escape or evacuate from this area. If we are talking about Marinka, as you can see, the Russians activated in Marinka heavily. As you can see, the Russians used their aircraft Su-25 storming and bombing this area. Also, they used tanks and everything they have just to get control over more streets in this area. Nobody talks about towns or square kilometers. If we're talking about Marinka, we're talking about single street or single house, and in comparison with this town, this is a very big progress. If the Russians are able to take control over another 10 or 5 buildings in this area, this is a very big progress if we're talking about Marinka. The Russians continue storming of Novomikhailivka from the south and Pavlovka from the south as well. There are still very heavy clashes. The Ukrainians managed to move their reinforcement in this area and to stop a little bit the Russians, to stop their progress. Anyway, the situation is still critical for both sides, because the Russians, I believe that they still want to continue, and they still can't stop. And the Ukrainians, of course, from their side, they can't stop as well, and they are not counting any losses from their side. They need to protect Vuhledar, no matter how much of Ukrainians this operation is going to cost. And the Russians understand this. But from the Russian side, of course, they have a habit not to lose their soldiers, and so that's why they're moving very slowly. And sometimes these things, like movement in very slow mode, makes them sometimes to possibilities to achieve success. After that, they are forced to lose everything they gained during the previous battles and to step back on the previous position. For now, the storming of Pavlovka, Marinka, and Mikhailovka continues. I believe they need another more days, another week, and after that we are going to see the results of these clashes. If we're talking about the front line between Orekhov, Gulay Polya, there are no changes in this area. And now we are moving to another interesting area, Kherson district. As you can see, there are three main directions that Ukrainians uses to attack. The first one in direction of Kherson, near Zelený Gай, near Благодатная, Kiselevka. But the Ukrainians were stopped in this area. Another area is Andreevka, Belohorivka bridgehead. The Ukrainians made another attempt in this area, but they were stopped. And today we got interesting update. As you can see, the Russian source map has been updated according to the report of Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation. Today we got at least maybe the third or fifth confirmation of the fact that Ukrainians were developing their offensive operation in direction of Mylova, this town. And this very important update, and as you can see, the previous configuration of the front line shows that the green line was the front line, but today we see that Ukrainians have possibilities to move in direction between Petykhatki, Sukhanova, Mylova, and the south suburbs of Duchany. So this area, this is the update on this map, showing that this area maybe is not under Ukrainian control, but at least in the gray zone. And this very important update, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians reported Ukraine lost around 110 soldiers and something around 17 armored vehicles. As you can see, the Ukrainians are not counting their losses, and the thing is that, let's say, by filling these fields with Ukrainian bodies, they managed to start offensive operation in direction of Mylova. And this is very important for many reasons, and one of them is that if the Ukrainians are able to develop their offensive operation in direction of Mylova, to develop every single square meter had a big price. In this case, they will be able to cut the Russians' position in Kachkarovka, Sablukovka, and southwest part of Duchany. The Russians in this area will be cut off from the mainland, and we understand that from that moment, the Russians won't be able to have any possibilities to be supported. There are like just one bridge in this area that's still in the Russian control, that they can use this bridge to support their forces in this area. But if the Ukrainians continue their developing in this area, that means that the Russians will be forced to leave these positions and to move to the, let's say, main Kherson land. And if you are talking about Ukrainians, it will give them more land on the bank of this river, and of course this is very good for them because they will be able to move their artillery closer to the Russian mainland, and from this position they will be at least to give another 10 kilometers, 5-10 kilometers to attack the Russians on this area. So as you can see, slowly, step by step, square meter by square meter, another body for another Ukrainian body, they're moving and pushing the Russians back. So we'll see, and this, of course, this bridgehead is very important for the Russians. It's very nice to defend, but for now, as you can see, we see that the Russians have problems, and these problems confirmed by the Russian sources. If we're talking one more time about the front lines are stable. If we're talking about the Ukraine energy facility, energy system, today we got a report, as we discussed yesterday. Zelensky confirmed that, the president of Ukraine confirmed that now the Ukraine lost around 40% of energy capability of entire Ukraine. As we discussed, I believe that by the end of the next week, we are going to see the number of 45 or 50%. Also, the Ukrainians reported that they are able to let's say, to work the same mode more around 30-40 days, and after that, the entire system will be collapsed, not destroyed, but then. If we're talking about the energy facility, the energy system, now the energy system of Ukraine works as one single entity. And it's a single entity, but in 30-40 days of the same level of attack, the entire Ukraine will be split into a few different separate energy islands. So the west will work for itself, the north for itself, the south for itself, the west the east for itself, and there are going to be a lot of regions that will be completely cut from the energy, and the Ukrainians will be forced to start, like, let's say, global evacuation process, because a lot of towns, if the Russians continue the same will be freezed during the winter. And of course it will bring more losses among civilians, because highly unlikely that it's possible to survive during the upcoming winter if you don't have at least electricity. And that means that you don't have water as well. If we're talking about electricity, you need to understand that if there is no electricity, that means that there is no water as well. And that's it for today. Military Summer channel reminds you can condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your like, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.